But as we begin, I'm going to ask Brother Roger to lead us in a word of prayer, primarily because he's sitting in the back and I'm sure his voice will carry forward. So if you will. Man. Now, I did have a PowerPoint ready because I actually printed it out, but I copied it wrong to my flash drive, so they were unable to project it. So I could hold this up and flip each page as I go, but just so you know that I wasn't going to rely on you strictly listening to me and watching me through the class, but I would have had something up there. So by Wednesday, I'm sure I'll copy it better, and we'll have that up there. Hebrews chapter 3 is where we're starting. Jim and Jay had covered chapter 1 and chapter 2. And the writer of Hebrews is emphasizing to a group of apparently Hebrew or Jewish Christians that there is a need to re-embrace Christianity and not go back to the old ways or the old law. Chapter 3 is going to deal with the superiority of Moses, or a superiority of Jesus over Moses, and Jesus' work and his person. Then the second part of the chapter is going to be dealing with falling away. Wednesday night we'll probably get to that section, and we're going to look at why people do leave the church. Now, the other thing that the control room had mentioned to me, I was going to have my movable podium over on the side so I could drift up and down the hallway, but they said that would require them to move the camera. So, you know, not only do I not have my PowerPoint, so you're going to have to rely visually and verbally on listening to me, but I'm also kind of stuck here in the middle, because I did watch the last time I taught the adult class out here, and it was pretty boring, but I'll try to be better today. But every time I moved away from this little podium, I was not on camera, and of course that kind of reduced those that were watching at home. So chapter 3, read with me verses 1 and 2. Therefore, holy brethren, partakers of heavenly calling, consider Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession. He was faithful to him who appointed him, as Moses also was in his house. Now, my first PowerPoint, I even hate to even hold it up for those of you who couldn't see it, was Jesus an apostle? Now, of course, you read the first verse, and it does say that he was an apostle. What is a transliterated word? Now, Brother Don Boyd is not out here, is he? Because he gave a very good presentation in our study on Jesus and his authority on transliterated words, which are untranslated words, which are words that basically the creator or the translators have created to convey an idea. And for us, they're all very modern. Now, what I have on here is baptism, church, apostle, Sabbath, deacon. These are all transliterated words. The original Greek has a meaning, but these words were created because by the time the English version of the New Testament was created, many religious groups existed, and they had preconceived ideas, preconceived teachings, and those that were translating the Bible into English wanted to give them the leeway to interpret those words the way they wanted. Baptism, by the time the King James Bible, you could be sprinkled, you could be poured, and religious groups had moved away from immersing people in water. And we know what the word baptism is. Baptizo, it means to immerse, to wash. I say I only know one translation today that uses the word immersion wherever you see that Greek word. So church, by the time the King James Bible was translated, churches, religious groups, had organizations outside of the body. That is, they had a universal organization that was dictating how congregations were to work, worship, and act. Now, apostle, the word apostle didn't come into the English vernacular until the 900s. Now, we always look at apostle as kind of being limited to what group of people in the New Testament. Stephen, that's right, or Steve, that's right. It is the 12 apostles that were selected by Jesus. But what does the Greek word mean? Now, up on my PowerPoint, let me turn my page so at least I have my notes. What I'll do is whenever we look at a Greek word, I'll give the number of the Greek word, which corresponds to Strong's or Thayer's Theological Dictionary. 652, one who is sent, is the basic meaning of the word apostle, which has a very secular meaning to it. In English, we might call it an emissary or an ambassador. Now, what is an ambassador in our language? Someone who represents a government officially. That when someone has that title, ambassador, we know that some government in the world has designated them to be their official spokesman. So when we come across the word apostle, we always think of the 12 apostles that were chosen by Jesus. And we don't always expand that thought or that meaning of the word apostle to anyone else. Now here, Jesus is called the apostle and the high priest. Two different religious groups. The apostles were leaders of the Christian church, the Church of Christ. And the high priest was the leader of the Jewish faith. So to call Jesus the apostle and high priest is to give him that importance over all others. Now, how many people were called apostles? Now, if I had this up on the PowerPoint, it'd be a little bit easier to follow. How many? Well, we know there were 12 apostles. How many apostles were selected after that? There were 2 more. Brings us up to 14. Now, how many people were actually called apostles in the New Testament? 18. But we don't recognize the others in addition to Paul and Matthias as being part of that original 12 that were chosen to be leaders in the church. Paul was chosen out of season, and here we have Jesus being called an apostle. But not an apostle in that sense that he was one of the original 12. He was the one that was choosing them. But it's a title in the New Testament that we see as a leadership title. So the other term we have here is that of high priest. Priest comes from a Greek word which references to one who is required to act as a mediator and perform spiritual duties. So in this first verse, we have Jesus being referred to as our high priest and our apostle. 2 religious groups, and it's very easy to see how preeminence of those 2 positions. So what is a high priest? Now, when we study the Old Testament, and I think Jim had mentioned to me this morning, he's going to get into the tabernacle. Is the temple ever mentioned in the book of Hebrews? Anyone know? It's not. So what's the difference between the tabernacle and the temple? The tabernacle is mentioned. When we look at the book of Hebrews, it seems to go to maybe this is a kind of a poetic way to put it, goes back to the purity of the Old Testament. The writer of Hebrews talks about the high priest, talks about the tabernacle, never mentions the temple. Now we know that David was authorized to build the temple. There were several temples after that, and by the time we get to this period in New Testament history, the temple is a very large complex, far more than just what the tabernacle was. The tabernacle was basically that place of worship, the Holy of Holies and the Most Holy, and with the tent on the outside. And by this time, the temple complex, you have the court of the Gentiles, you have the court of the Hebrews, you have many different aspects to it. So the high priest in the Old Testament, what was he? What were his duties? So obviously it comes to the point to where you have priests, all coming from the tribe of Aaron, but then you have a high priest. And his primary duties focused on the Day of Atonement. Chapter 9 in Hebrews is going to go into that Day of Atonement and what he did, what he went into, and what he explored. So in the Old Testament, we have the high priest being the leader of the Jewish people, the leader of the priests. Now, we also have a phrase in the New Testament, which is not found in the Old Testament, chief priests. We often find the chief priests coming to Jesus, having issues with him, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the chief priests. No mention of them in the Old Testament. But what were chief priests? Does anyone know? Chief priests were a smaller group of priests that were assigned certain duties. And I could hold up like the outline so you can see it, but it's too small, no one can read it. The captain of the temple, Acts 5:24 is the one place he is mentioned. The director of weekly course, the director of daily course, the temple overseer, and the treasurer. Now it's kind of interesting because really what the captain of the temple was, what we refer to, and today when we have like a public meeting, many organizations will have someone who is a sergeant of arms. What is a sergeant of arms? And I guess like American Legion or any club that has like a large group meeting, they will assign someone who is a sergeant at arms, and that's what the captain of the temple. Out of all these, and I'd mentioned 5 different chief priests positions, and the only one that's mentioned is in Acts 5:24, where the captain of the temple was there dealing with the apostles or with the disciples. So what is a sergeant at arms? Someone who is there to keep order in a public assembly. So the captain of the temple here, which was one of the chief priests, no doubt there was often a lot of unruly people in the temple, and there needed to be basically a police force, a military arm of the temple, where the captain of the temple was in charge of all these priests who were basically sergeant at arms to make sure that no one got out of line. Now, in the temple, there were certain areas where Gentiles were not allowed to go. You have to have someone at the door who's going to stop a Gentile from coming in if they were to try. There may have been issues with attire, how people were dressed. Sergeant at arms would take care of that. Now, in the church, we have many duties. Elders and deacons are assigned various duties. One of the duties that the chief priest had was that of treasurer. And we have our treasurer, Chris Walker. We all know him as a treasurer. We don't necessarily assign him that title. We say that, he's a deacon and he's in charge of finances. So you can see how even here in the hierarchy of this, they had various different ways of dealing with their needs in the temple. But Jesus here is referred to in this first verse as the high priest and also the apostle to establish certain position of authority or rank. Jim? Mm-hmm.
God, the high priest approached God on behalf of me.
Mm-hmm.
The Holy of Holies, the Day of Atonement. So it's that back and forth relationship. People really, both roads.
All right. Very good point that Jim brought up about the duties of the high priest. In Hebrews 9, the whole chapter, verses 1 through 29. Now, in our studies, Jim is going to take the first, Jay is going to take the second chapter, I'm taking the third. So I'll have the third, the sixth, the ninth, and the 12th. And it just so happens that in 2 more sessions, I'll come back to Hebrews 9, which the writer of Hebrews here is dealing with the Day of Atonement, because he will start to build on this idea of Christ's superiority over Moses, the superiority of the new law over the old law. And one of the points he's going to bring about is how the sacrifice of Christ was better than the sacrifice on the Day of Atonement. So we have the high priest, which originally he didn't have a lot of administrative duties. In New Testament times, the high priest becomes the temple administrator, which means he has to assign various duties and functions to all the other priests. He has to be the leader of the priests, which dealt a lot with training. He was also the national leader because Israel was a nation in and by itself. So he became the highest figure. When there wasn't a king, the high priest was the national leader. Now, we could probably make some references to Christ being all those things in the New Testament church, but the function of the high priest really revolved around the Day of Atonement. He was the only one that was allowed to go into the Holy of Holies. He had to perform functions of himself days prior to going in there, and then some special functions the day of atonement before he could go in, under penalty of death. The old law says that, if you don't cleanse yourself, if you don't dress yourself, when you approach me in the Holy of Holies, and he was the only one allowed to go in there, and he would go in there and offer the blood of goat and the blood of bull in order to roll forward. We talk about forgiveness of sins in the Old Testament. We really don't see the forgiveness of sins till Christ comes and dies on the cross. But his job was to go in there. Now, we don't think a lot about various miscellaneous things, but Jesus shed and died on the cross for our sins, that they would be removed, they'd be washed away. Mark 16:16, he that believeth and is baptized will be saved. And at that point, our sins are washed away. The high priest of the Old Testament is very symbolic of that sacrifice. So what I've always wondered about, and maybe someone has an answer, Jim has done a lot of Old Testament studies, and the priest would go in, Jim, would go in once a year and sprinkle blood on the mercy seat, the Ark of the Covenant. Did he clean it when he was done sprinkling the blood on it? He was the only one that was allowed to go in there. There's no mention of that. So I've often wondered, did he go in there year after year, and was this thing covered with blood from all the previous high priests who had sprinkled it? Did he sprinkle it on there, and did he clean it before he left? There's no mention of it, so I've often wondered. There's probably some reference to that in Jewish history. Have you ever heard the story that the high priest had a rope tied onto his leg when he went in? It's not true. That is an urban myth. No mention of it in the Old Testament, no mention of it in Jewish history, to I think well after New Testament times. The thought was, and someone created this thought, that if he had not sanctified himself properly before God, and when he went into the Holy of Holies, he would be struck dead. Well, what do you do if you're the rest of the priesthood and the high priest just went into the Holy of Holies and he died? And if you go in there, you're not the high priest. You haven't sanctified yourself. You will be struck down as well. So how do you get him out? Well, someone came up with the story, you tie a rope around his leg, and if he should die, then you pull him back out until another high priest can be put into place. That is an urban legend. There's no history, there's no account of that for centuries with the Jewish people. Now, it makes for a very nice story, and maybe a lot of times people have repeated that as an urban legend and a very nice story. So we have Jesus here being listed as this high priest. Verse 2 says, he was faithful to him who appointed him, as Moses also in all of his house. If we look at the next two verses, read with me 3 and 4. For he has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, by just so much as the builder of the house has more honor than the house. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now, not to dig too much into word mongering, if you will, we have in this section the word builder, verse 4. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. We find this word appearing twice in the book of Hebrews, and they each are translated builder, but they have a little different meaning. This meaning is more like the architect, the creator of a building of something. And then in Hebrews 10 and 11, it's used for more of a craftsman, someone who's actually doing the builder. So, I think it's going to be Jay who's going to get to chapter 11 several weeks from now. We probably won't remember this, but I'll bring it up in class if Jay does not recall it. So how many verses in the New Testament, how many concepts in the New Testament deal with building? If I ask you how many deal with fields and field workers, we can think of a lot of those. How many other passages or concepts in the New Testament? We have a lot that deal with field workers. We have a lot that deal with military and weapons. How about building? Scott, can you think of another passage in the New Testament that deals with building?
Yeah, that's the Lord builds it. Builders counting the cost.
All right, and Scott is certainly right. That what he had mentioned was counting the cost. Jesus tells a story that no one builds an army and goes to war, no one builds a tower until they sit down and count the cost. Jesus' story of someone who builds on the sand, someone who builds on a rock. The cornerstone is Jesus, and all the priests in the New Testament, which are us, are the building stones. There's another passage that talks about how Christ is the foundation, and that's also composed of the prophets and the apostles. So we don't find a lot of imagery, if you will, in the New Testament about building, but there is a little bit of it. So when we come to this, kind of a unique setting for the writer of Hebrews to talk about someone who builds the house and the house itself. Now, of course, we have him talking here about Moses has a house, Jesus has a house. What is Moses' house? What was that? People of Israel, the Old Testament, because that's going to be the Hebrew writer's theme throughout much of the book of Hebrews. That you have this old law that God had put in place, and Moses had his glory, the Israelites had their glory. God often wrapped his arms around them, did miraculous things for them, but they always strayed away. Now we're going to see a little bit of that same theme, and part of that theme is going to start here in the second part of chapter 3 about falling away. And that's going to be a central theme to the book of Hebrews, that Christ is superior to any of the leadership in the old law, which was Moses. Any of the people living at this time see Moses, sit at Moses' feet? No. Now, some that are reading this letter could have very well sat at Jesus' feet, could have heard what he was talking about, could have seen his miracles, and that's a very strong message. At the end of the Gospels, Jesus declares that, I'm going to give these miraculous gifts in order to confirm the word, so that when people go out and they preach, Jesus Christ is the Son of God, he came to this world, he died on the cross, he rose the third day, and whoever believes in him and is baptized will be saved, the miracles were going to create a stronger foundation for people to believe in those things. Have you ever wondered what Jesus' ministry would have been like if he had simply stood up and spoken lessons, if he had performed no miracle, if he hadn't fed the 5,000, if he hadn't raised the dead? Probably in our minds we would think about it and say, maybe half the number of people would have been converted, because the miracles were powerful, and God used those miracles to confirm the word, to say these things that they're speaking. So we have Moses. Did Moses perform miracles? Were there miraculous things that Moses did during his, I'm not sure if you call it his ministry or his lifetime, or during his leadership? Absolutely. When the Israelites left Egypt, one of the things they said about the Passover was, when your children ask, why are you doing these things? You'll refer back to those miracles that freed you from the land of Egypt. And we could probably think of half a dozen or a dozen things that Moses did that were miraculous. So, a strong leader in that sense. But now, Jesus comes, and the writer of Hebrews comes to this, and he talks about the glory of Jesus is greater than the glory of Moses. Well, what's the word glory mean? John, what's the word glory mean? Correct. Some people might say, well, I do this for the glory of God. I do this for the glory of the church. Well, it's to bring honor, to bring respect. So, in that sense, he was counted worthy of more honor, respect, glory than Moses. And part of the reference to that are the two houses. Jim? Mm-hmm.
Draw a parallel between what you're talking about, Moses, and salvation of Egypt, and salvation of Christ. But I want to back up. It's interesting. He refers to it here as holy And then so they're joined together. Well, I think they're believers. These are not people that don't believe in Jesus. And it's really interesting to me that if you remember back in John, Jesus meets Mary Magdalene. Well, up until that time, Christ's followers were always referred to as his disciples. And then Jesus tells Mary Magdalene, don't tell my friends. That's the term of dignity and honor, really. They call it holy brethren. Here you are, holy brethren. Remember these things.
Yeah.
Powerful. They talk about their confession.
Right.
It's kind of, we don't really ignore in Hebrews. He's laying the case.
All right, good points. Now, what Moses' house? We said it was the Israelites. What did the nation of Israel consist of? Because when we come to the New Testament, easy answer. What is the house of Jesus? It's the church. Elders, deacons, members, evangelists, and teachers. Going out in the world, spreading the gospel. Coming together on the Lord's Day, worshiping God. That is the consistency of the Lord, the house, as reference to this. Now, God's house, you could say the universe, all of his creation. So what was Moses' house? We say in a simple response in term, the Israelite nation. What did the Israelite nation consist of that made up Moses' house? Because we're going to have a large number of people. At a time, it has the tabernacle where the people come to worship. There were certain sacrifices, worship activities prescribed to be done throughout the year in order to show homage to God. They seem to have, at a moment's call, a standing army that would go out and physically fight against other nations. Was there a hand up? Oh, no. Okay. So we see that as a house of God. How is the church having more glory, Bob? All right. All right. So when Moses was alive and he was leading the people, they were in the wilderness. And of course, the people were traveling in the wilderness. They didn't have their land. They didn't have, which later became the city of Jerusalem or any of those notable places. So Moses is attributed to building the house. Leads the people out of Egypt. They spend 40 years traveling in the wilderness because of their and he's not allowed to enter into it. The issue with water and how, he spoke to a rock versus, hitting the rock. So the house of Moses then becomes the nation of Israel. Well, they conquer the land. They become prosperous in the land, and eventually they say, we want kings like other people. So that's what we typically think of the house of Moses. We don't use that term. This is one of the few places it's kind of referred to in that sense. But we don't think so much of the house of Moses as the Israelites traveling through the wilderness, wandering through the wilderness. But we think more of the house of Moses, the nation of Israel. When they settle the land, they become prosperous. They start to grow things, an agricultural community. We don't read much about manufacturing or seafaring with the Israelites. But that's what we think of the nation of Israel, is that small piece of land in the Middle East that they settle in, that they start to grow in. Then, of course, their unbelief always pulls them away.
Right, quickly brought our mind back to Numbers chapter 12. That's the story of the dissension between Aaron and Miriam towards Moses. And God said, talking about Moses, he is faithful in all my house. I speak to him face to face, and he will plainly deny not in the dark side. So they could be drawing the Jewish audience's mind back to that, what God is supposed to do.
All right.
Back to the dissension.
All right. Very good. All right. Very good point with that. So now we come to the church. And what is the house of Jesus or the church? The church is the people, not referring to, the building that we're in today, but it's the people of God under the New Testament age. What are its borders? What are its limits? Worldwide. Here we have the nation of Israel that settled in this small piece of land, becomes prosperous, and they have constant bickering among themselves. But I don't think that's how they look at the house. The Jews, the Hebrews looked at the house of Moses, the Israelite nation, as great and glorious under God's leadership. But a small piece of land that they were locked into with their practice of worship, the Day of Atonement, and all those things. Now, Jesus comes, and his kingdom is worldwide, every nation, including the Gentiles eventually. Took them 10 years, took a miracle to Peter to be convinced that he needed to go to the Gentiles, but then it spreads out through the whole world, the known world at that time. And today, Christians meet around the world. So when you say, let's compare the two nations, let's compare the two kingdoms, one is worldwide, one was locked into that little nation. So all of these ideas can come into playing here and what the writer of Hebrews says here. So let's turn over to Matthew 3, 16 and 17. The servant versus the Son of God. Moses was a servant of God. Jesus was the Son of God. Bob, if you could, read Matthew 3, 16 and 17 for us. All right, always in hierarchy of families, is a son going to be held in higher regard than a servant? Our answer would be yes. Do we occasionally see a movie on at the theaters or on TV where a servant is held in higher regard than the son? We do sometimes. That's for that emotional drama, so it can draw us into the story so we can appreciate it. So why in, let's say, family hierarchy is a son held higher in place of a servant? Hereditary, birthright. Think of Old Testament examples where there was a servant who raised to a high notoriety. Daniel was certainly one, because God blessed him in the things that he was doing. We can look back, though, and see in many other situations where family hierarchy really dictates these things. So his point here, verses 3 and 4, was Moses was but a servant, and if you look at his house, it's not anything comparable to the house of Jesus. His lineage is far superior, being the Son of God, than it was to Moses, who was a servant. And Moses has many resounding stories to his life. Placed in a basket, placed in an ark, as we learned last night at the young men's class, and raised in Pharaoh's house, and goes on to lead the nation, flees to another country, the burning bush. I mean, there's such richness in Moses' story, but still, he is but a servant. And then Jesus, who comes, is the Son of God. And so much of our biblical belief surrounds around that. Now, why do we give praise to the Creator? Let's turn over to Revelations 4 and 11. I'm going to ask Jim if he'll read that for us. Revelations 4:11.
Revelation 4:11. You are worthy, O Lord, to receive glory, honor, and power, for you created all things, and by your will they exist and were created.
All right. This passage here tells us that Jesus should have more glory than Moses. We don't pray to Moses. We don't see praise and honor being bestowed towards Moses. Often the people are kind of upset with him, not very happy with him as a leader. But with the Father and the Son, we see this idea of praise about the things they have done. Now, in our Bible study on prayer, one of the things that Tim Beaver noted in our class is when you study Old Testament prayers, you almost universally in every one of those prayers, there is the praise of God's name, there's the praise of God's works, primarily creation, being the creator. Now, when we study Matthew 6, the Lord's Prayer, the disciples came and said, teach us, like John was teaching his disciples, how to pray. And what's the first thing that Jesus says? Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Now, what does that mean? What does hallow mean? Give praise to, give honor to, give respect to. And I think that's something that's very important, that as we note in these verses, glory is to be given to the Son, honor and respect. So this is the same way, because we give praise to the Creator. Well, we could say because Revelations 4:11 tells us to. We have, by example, in the Old Testament, the prayers recorded there are always giving people, or always giving God, praise with his creation and his respect. But it's this very idea of creation. We've studied several times in class about the magnificence of the universe, the things that are out there and what God has created. And that's something we find to be a very common theme. So here with Jesus and Moses in these comparison, son, creator versus servant and leader. Okay, the next section here that I want to cover today is verses 5 and 6. Now, verse 5 and 6, it says, now Moses was faithful in all his house as a servant, as a testimony of those things which were to be spoken later. But Christ was faithful as a son over his house, whose house we are. And if we hold fast our confidence and boast of our hope firm until the end. This is kind of leading up into the next section about falling away. What we see here, especially in this last part of verse 6, often referred to as part B, if we hold fast our confidence and boast of our hope until the end. Now, what does it mean to hold fast our confidence? He's going to set up the very next section where he starts to talk about in verse 12, about falling away from the living God. So this is kind of his introduction. Moses was faithful, and we understand that, but Christ was faithful as a son, and we have to hold fast our confidence now and boast of our hope firm until the end. So we have two aspects, boasting and confidence. What is confidence? Scott, what is confidence? All right. Now, Scott mentioned believing that something is going to happen, having faith in it. And we often talk about people who are confident. Well, we often see this because they exhibit certain attributes because they are confident. They're willing to speak. They are willing to act. So he moves from holding fast our confidence and the boast of our hope and firm until the end. Is there a Christian obligation for us to be verbal? We would say, yeah, there absolutely is. Now, we can be verbal, we often have heard lessons, in two different ways. By our actions, by all of you being here today for services, for Bible class, and then for services, it speaks, it has an action that is speaking. It says you believe. It says that you feel you have a responsibility. It says that in your mind, it says that you ought to be here. I often don't like that word ought, because you ought to be doing things in life. You ought to be treating people a certain way. And that's really the strength of that word. It talks about a moral, mental, spiritual obligation to do things. Now, we would all like to say, well, I'm here because I hold fast the truth of Jesus Christ, because I love the brethren. I'm not there because I feel like I ought to be. Your children go to school because they ought to be there. We often show up at our job because we ought to be there. It's not connected with money, is it? We just have some moral obligation. No, it's obviously connected to that. So we have a confidence that we believe these things to be true, and we have an obligation to boast about them. Jay?
When you asked about the boasting and kind of this confidence, one of the examples I was thinking about was Daniel 3, where you've got Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You know that story since we were little, and basically they kind of go through that whole thing, and all right, this is your last chance, and they basically are like, look, we're not going to do it, and even if you throw us in there, God has the power to save us, and even if He doesn't, we're still not going to do what you're asking us to do. So
Right.
it's that to be boasting in a hope that you have that is God-based, right? It's not a self-confident boasting or anything like that. We're not going to do what you say. We're going to do what God says.
All right, now Jay shared with us Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, which is a very powerful story, which has a very powerful emotional aspect to it, where they say, we're not going to bow down, we're not going to worship you, God can save us. But even if He doesn't, we're still not going to bow down and save you. Of course, in our story, they are saved miraculously, and that's why we embrace it in such a way. So our confidence and our boasting about our hope until the end. The end of what? Now, we could look at the end of our life, which is certainly true, or the end of time when Jesus Christ returns again for us. So leading up to this next section about these people hardening their hearts, these people falling away, these people struggling with staying with Christianity, the last thing the writer of Hebrews says here, Jesus is better than Moses, and what we're going to do in our house is we're going to hold fast our confidence. Anyone here remember in high school when you had to go to gym class and you had to climb the rope? Maybe they don't do that anymore. If we had any, we do have young people in here, so I could ask them if, I was going to say we don't have any young people in here, but then I looked around. But maybe for the boys, maybe not the girls, did you have to climb a rope in gym class? Well, one of the things you had to do to get up the rope is you had to hold fast, which means you really grip it. You really have some intention of reaching the top. So that's what he says about, our confidence and our boasting, is we have to really hold fast to these things. We're going to see that idea repeated in various ways throughout the book of Hebrews. Chapter 12, where he says, don't let the world entangle you. Stay focused on that. Dan, you had your hand up?
Yeah, it's really interesting how here he really insinuates very strongly that those that if we don't hold fast, we were never part of his house. And that's a very interesting thing to think about. It's almost like, we occasionally hear teachers, especially when someone's about to be baptized, talk about the seriousness of the commitment, because it's a lifelong commitment. It is a serious commitment. And so, the writer here, I think, is emphasizing that people who do not hold fast their hope are kind of never part of this house to begin with.
Right, good point that Dan makes in moving into this next section, because we are just about out of time. I didn't hear the first or second buzzer, but we are just about out of time. Wednesday night, we're going to talk about the next section. He starts with an example of how, under the old law, the Israelites often fell away. They departed godly living. And he is then going to talk about this idea of falling away. So one question I'm going to ask, we won't cover it tonight, but what is unbelief? When we read through Hebrews, he's going to talk about them not just falling away, but moving to unbelief. We could, and I would use Mark 16:16, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. He that believeth not will be lost. Certainly that kind of defines unbelief for us. And what are reasons why people leave the church, fall away? Here, they were going back to Judaism, but we'll talk about why people leave the church. We'll cover that Wednesday night.